All right, good morning everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about why GMOs are bad for our society. Before I get started, how many of you know what a GMO is? All right, awesome. Okay, the World Health Organization defines genetically modified organisms, aka GMOs, as organisms in which genetic material, DNA, has been altered in a way that does not occur naturally. This relatively new science creates unstable combinations of plant, animal, bacteria, viral genes that do not occur in nature or through traditional crossbreeding methods. Foods that contain GMOs are mostly packaged foods, ingredients that are derived from corn, soy, canola, and sugar beet. And the vast majority of our crops in North America are genetically modified. GMOs are bad for our society because they're harmful to our environment, and most importantly, they're harmful to our bodies. They're harmful to our environment because the pesticides and herbicides that we use on GM crops pollute the air and water and soil. In 1996, a company named Monsanto developed Roundup-ready crops that are crops genetically modified to resist their herbicide, Roundup. This was made so that farmers could plant these crops and spray the herbicide, and it would only kill the weeds and not the crops. Between 1996 and 2008, U.S. farmers sprayed an extra 383 million pounds of herbicides on the GM crops, which resulted in super weeds growing, and these became resistant to the herbicide that they were using. Since they were resistant, farmers just kept spraying more and more of this toxic herbicide on their crops, which not only harms the environment, but harms genetically modified food, which contains like a higher residue of toxic herbicides. When we look at the dangers of GM foods, we look at herbicide Roundup because the main active ingredient is glyphosate. This ingredient that is in the Roundup herbicide causes nutritional deficiencies and is linked to health problems such as cancer, birth defects, obesity, and other chronic illnesses. And that gets processed into our food because these crops have absorbed that herbicide. According to the American Academy of Environmental Medicine, numerous health problems increased after GMOs were invented in 1994. The percentage of Americans with 3 or more chronic illnesses jumped from 7% to 13% in just 9 years. They also cited animal studies that show organ damage and immune system disorders, accelerated aging, and infertility. For human studies, they showed that GM food will leave behind material in our bodies which could have long-lasting problems. Also, both pesticides and GMOs have been connected to the increased risk of certain types of cancer. It's also damaging to our digestive system because you can get a syndrome called leaky gut syndrome from having too much of this toxins in your system, and it causes inflammation throughout your body. So in conclusion, GMOs are bad for our society because they're not only polluting our environment, but they have negative effects on our well-being that cause increase in chronic illnesses, rise in food allergies, and toxins that enter our digestive systems. Thank you.
All right, Morgan, I think you've got a pretty good start with one exception, and that's the same one that I've mentioned to other people. Your proposition is a question rather than a claim. You're going to tell us why GMOs are bad for society.
Okay.
No, you're going to tell us GMOs are bad for society. Let's not get that rid of. I don't know why people insist on putting that quote, that word in there. Though, why, how, when, is. You're making a declarative statement. We're back to that position. Don't be shy because you're making it later on in the speech, so it ought to be clear at the beginning.
Yeah.
All right. Other than that, though, I thought the opening was pretty solid because you preview the contents well. You tell us that there's a threat to the environment and a threat to our bodies, so that's fine. And I think that you give us a little bit of a context for the issue, so that's pretty good as well. The signposting on the first point mentions environmental risks, and you spend some time talking about the pesticides and the herbicides and kind of explaining what's going on there. The proof on the risk, I think, is a little problematic. For example, you mentioned super weeds at one point, and I'm going, and where did this evidence come from, and what's it based on? I didn't hear a source or authority. I'm sure that you got the information from someplace, but it's not being presented in the speech. And any quantification of that. The one thing that you did have is you had some statistical, well, basically some factual data on the amount of herbicides and pesticides that had been used in that time period, that what is it, 14-year time period that you're talking about here. And I thought that that was good information, but now I'm looking for the follow-up that says, so there was, this impact on the environment. Instead, mostly what we got is kind of, well, it's been linked to this, it's known to have some influence on that, but we don't get any quantification on that. And I think that that's an underwhelming sort of kind of proof that people use to kind of make an association without providing data to support that point is a little problematic. So I think that it needs a stronger follow-through on that. The notion that the farmers, for example, use substantially more and that gets absorbed in the crops, that's what I need to see also. That seems like a presupposition, and that it gets absorbed in the crops and that people consume it. And that gets us to that second point where there's a risk to health. Now, at the end of the speech, you mentioned allergens and toxins as things that would have been secondary points, but I didn't see any data on allergies in your presentation. The toxin stuff, the one thing that I had was the information that you said that it went from 7% to 13% of these kind of health effects, although we're again back to this kind of correlation that's going on here and attributing causation to this, and I think that you need something that's a little bit more definitive on that. For example, if you had some medical data that suggested that the exposure levels to this have produced this particular kind of outcome, that would be easier to point to and say, oh, well, we know that these diseases are affiliated with this thing that occurs because of GMOs, and therefore we can see this result. Otherwise, it's just sort of like, well, we've got a statistical correlation, and I'm not sure that we want to be jumping to a conclusion off that. That's a good starting point, but I think you need some follow-up on it. And I think that that's one of those things that you're going to discover is a little problematic here, that it just needed to be filled in a little bit. So you've got a good skeleton of the argument, you kind of explained the concept a bit. I just think it needs to be developed a lot more, and some of the evidence needs to be a lot more convincing. Well, like I said, it's hard to put it in context. We'll see what the other side has to say about those kinds of issues, because I imagine that there's going to be data on those things too. All right, thank you.